Hey, hello, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of getting students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I work at IE Business School Publishing, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials.
Woof, and today we have an amazing guest. I have to say, we don't always have incredible gurus like Karl Kapp, who is our guest today. And the first thing that we have to know of you, Karl, is are you prepared to engage?
I am, yes.
Let's do this, Karl. So he's in amongst many other things. I told him before I picked this up from his professor's page, but if you go to karlkapp.com, you can get the whole jazz of all the things that he's amazing at. So the first thing is that he's the assistant director and faculty member at Bloomsburg University's Institute for Interactive Technologies and teaches the courses like managing multimedia projects, applying theories of learning for interactive technologies, e-learning concepts, and techniques in learning in 3D. He certainly believes in teaching, education, and learning is an interactive exchange between students and the instructor that can take place both within and outside of the classroom or the online environment. His graduate level teaching reflects this belief that the learning and understanding stems from interaction. All of his classes and courses include a problem-based learning approach. The students must interact with the material and apply the theory to gain answers. Theory is important, we all know that, but practical application is critical to success as well. So his instructional and teaching methodologies ensure that knowledge is retained, learning is applied, and the results are visible. So Karl, let's get started with the first question. And as a sort of warm-up, we always ask our guests to tell us what a regular day looks like to be Karl Kapp.
Right. Well, I wish I knew the answer to that, but let me give you one as it kind of unfolds. So one of the things that I like to do in the morning is that's when I like to write. So everybody's sleeping. It's really quiet. So my normal day starts with a little bit of writing, maybe a little bit of research, depending on what I'm working on. Then I go into the university. It's about 10 miles from where I live. And I get to interact with students at the university. And as any university, deal with the university paperwork. So they're always making up some new kind of paperwork that I have to fill out. So I do that, have office hours, usually have lunch with a colleague or just grab a quick bite to eat. And then the afternoon, usually work on projects. So through the Bloomsburg University, we have the Institute for Interactive Technologies, and that institute works on projects with clients in an effort to give our students real-world experience with instructional design, e-learning projects, game projects, that kind of stuff. And then so I work during that time period both with clients and with students or graduate assistants who work on those projects. And then at night from 6 to 9 o'clock at night is when we actually teach our courses. So then at 6 o'clock I put on my professor hat and we have a course from 6 to 9 o'clock with a couple breaks in there and go through the teaching. And that's a day where I'm not traveling or not doing a webinar or not doing a workshop. So that's kind of the typical non-travel day.
Wow. Well, it sounds very, very interesting, very exciting, and very complete. Because if you start early in the morning, as many of us do, and you end up at 9 with your classes, I mean, you're not at 9 immediately teleporting to your bed.
Oh, I wish. That would be nice.
So you have quite a few things going on.
Right, yeah. The students keep it very energized. You know, people always say, oh, you're kind of a funny, you know, you kind of funny when you present or whatever, you're high energy or whatever. I say, I have to be because at, 8 o'clock at night, not only are the students tired, but I'm tired too. So if I don't entertain myself, we're all sleeping.
Yeah, let the students do the sleeping every once in a while. We have to stay awake. No, I know that the Karl's, just like this interview, is going to be, I'm sure, a lot of fun. His classes are definitely fun. You can check out many of his talks. There's lots of materials you can find on the internet of Karl. So Karl, we want to go now into the first question of into story mode, and the first question we would like to get from you is for you to tell us a story. of what you would call your favorite failure when creating, a game or a gamification project, for especially in your area in learning, which is our main focus, and that kind of failure that perhaps sets you up for learning or for future success. And we always enjoy these stories with the comebacks that I'm sure you have. So, give us an interesting story that you have. I would say the best, but that's always a risk.
Right. So there's lots of failure stories. So try to pick out the one that's the best. Would be a little bit difficult, but one I thought was really interesting. We were working with an online high school, actually a local high school to Bloomsburg, and they wanted a bunch of games, very simple games, really for terms and terminology. So I turned to a student and I said, "Hey, we want to create like kind of a hangman game. So it's where you fill the hangman and then you do kind of a definition of that," and kind of gave them the assignment and kind of went on my way. It wasn't a big part of the project, but it was a small part of the project. And then I said, when you're done, we'll look at it. Well, I got busy, didn't have a time to look at it. And I said, well, just go ahead and, show it to the client, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And then we can just move on. The client, being in this high school. And I got a call from the client going, "Oh my goodness, that is totally unacceptable." And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean it's unacceptable?" And of course they said, "Well, did you look at what he drew?" And I'm like, "No." And they go, "Look at it." And it was the most hideous scarecrow I'd ever seen. It still gives me chills. It was such a grotesque creature that he had drawn. I'm like, "What were you thinking? Like, this cannot work." And it turned them so much off to Hangman that we couldn't even do a Hangman game. I'm like, "Well, let's do, we'll hang." No, so it totally got us away from that. So we eventually talked them into, we had a game called, we flipped it around. So we had a caged Roadrunner, and we called the game Free the Roadrunner. And so the idea was if you got the questions right, it would deconstruct the cage for the Roadrunner and allow the Roadrunner to run on its way. So that was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it was so grotesque. I mean, his artistic ability was amazing, but he went totally in the wrong direction. He's like, "You said, a scary scarecrow." I'm like, "But not that scary. It's not Dawn of the Dead or The Walking Dead." So that was kind of an interesting story. And I have another, if I could tell one more.
Sure.
So we're working on this project and with this big company, and we said, "Hey, can we have the specs for your system?" And they said, "Sure." So they gave us the specs for their system, and then we started rolling it out to people to test it, and it wouldn't work on their platform. And we're like, "Well, I don't understand. You told us these were the specs. These were what we agreed upon in the contract and everything. So this should work." And they said, "Yeah, well, these are the specs for the new computers that we're handing out." I'm like, "Okay, well, how many people have those new computers?" They're like, 1% right now. We're going to roll it out over 3 months. I'm like, "Oh no." So we had to redo the whole platform to make sure that it would work on older computers, because we forgot to ask, well, how many people have this? So, kind of a typical technology mistake. But those are a couple stories that kind of at the moment stick out in my mind in terms of, pulling your hair out. Those are a couple.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would like to highlight from those stories. On the first one, instead of going for the learnings, which I will go into as well, that I had personally listening to you, the first one is the interesting approach of having, because of the characteristics of the class that you teach, and as you're teaching people to, in general, as I understand it, to do what you do. And at least that's the way I understood it. So they're like helping you to create your projects, and that's something that's extremely, I find it extremely interesting to involve people within their learning process to actually do the thing in a real life setting. Of course, then the learning came in, and and probably you want to set up a bit more of controls over what your amazing students are doing, because again, his talent was great, what he did was great. However, the context is something that he didn't completely understand. So that's what I would like to highlight as a learning there.
Exactly. And on the other one, those are good learnings.
Yeah, and on the other one, of course, the technology is always something you have to look out for, and I mean, many of the people listening to us might be experts or might not be experts in the technology, but as usual, just get the right information, get somebody who can help you out with the technology if it's something you need. Is what I would say. But what would you say are some key learnings that you got from those stories?
Right.
Karl?
So yeah, those are good. So from the technology standpoint, I would say don't take the client's word at face value in terms of the technology, right? So they're like, oh yeah, we had these, do a little bit of your own investigation. I would definitely say that. And then the other thing I would say is develop for a level lower than what you think the technology they have. Because there's also, I can tell you stories about other clients are like, oh yeah, we have audio, of course, no audio. So you kind of have to be careful about that. And then for the story with the students kind of creating projects, and that's one of the things that at Bloomsburg we're really proud of, the fact that students work with us on projects with clients. And most of the time that works well, sometimes it doesn't. But to do exactly what you said, use that as a teachable moment. And I always tell the students, I say, look, if you make a mistake here, that's okay. You're not going to get fired. You lose the big contract. Everybody knows that the students are working on the project. So use this as kind of the time to explore and see what the parameters are, knowing that you can fail kind of in a safe environment. And if you think of it, it's a lot like games, right? Games allow you to fail in a safe environment, and our lab, our institute, is this safe environment for the students to fail in. And the beauty of that is then once they go out into the field and somebody says, well, how would you do this? They don't need to say, well, in the book we learned such and such and such and such. They can say, well, guess what? I drew this scary character and the client didn't like it, so I had to stay up all night redrawing it. So those are the kind of experiences that you can't get unless you actually do the work.
Yeah, when you do the thing, you actually get to those experiences, and that's fantastic. That's why I wanted to highlight that side, because I do believe it's something that can be very, very useful. A previous guest, when we asked one of the questions, said, well, what you can do is get them to work on a real life project. I mean, of course, knowing that it's within the university, and give them something, give them product for them even to participate in a contest, see which of the products that they come up with is the winner, and they will actually implement it with their changes in the company or the NGO that they did before. So that's super interesting, and it's something that I believe in very much and apply it every time that we can.
Right. No, I agree 100%. The more hands-on experience you can have, the better. So that's really a good way to think about learning. It's that hands-on experiential learning that really takes the student to the next level.
Absolutely. So, Karl, the next thing that I would like to ask for you to give us as a story once again is what one of the biggest challenges that you faced. Maybe a client project, maybe in your teaching in the university. But you faced a challenge that you say, well, how do I do this? How do I approach this? And of course, you took out your toolbox and said, well, gamification, game-based learning, project-based learning, and how you faced that challenge and what you did to turn it into a success using gamification and game-based learning.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was working on a project for a company. So they wanted to teach their sales reps. They wanted to reinforce the sales skills. So they wanted to use kind of a branching simulation type of game. So I created was working on a game called Zombie Sales Apocalypse, which was a video game basically. So we used Unity to create it, and we were working on it, and the client was getting colder and colder feet as the project progressed. So they're like, I don't know about fantasy, if that's really going to work. And so I kind of explained how fantasy allows for the suspended disbelief, how you can then not bring the baggage of, I already know how to sell with me. And, you could just go ahead and kind of implement it. And they're like, I don't know if they're going to have the right equipment. I mean, every meeting I was getting more and more worried, and they were backing more and more off. And I'm like, well, you kind of already paid for this and whatever. But the company had a reputation of, they would start down a project sometimes and then they would just abandon the project. And so I'm like, we really need to talk to these folks and get them. They were coming together for the sales meeting. So it was starting to get really kind of frustrated. And so finally I said to them, I said, well, okay, we're bringing everybody together for this game. We really want them to do role plays. What if we abandon completely the video game part of it because you're worried about, and there's a whole list of things. I said, why don't we do a card game? And they were like, taken aback. Like, almost as if they didn't know that card games existed. I'm like, well, card games, I mean, they're a thing. We could do them. We could actually do a game with cards. We could do kind of a sales role play game. We could have one salesperson challenge another salesperson, and they could go through that game. And they're like, okay, well, let's see how that works. So I basically took some index cards, put together the game real quick, played it real quick, and they're like, oh yeah, this is going to work. And so totally changed the whole mood of the project, the whole direction of the project, the whole, I think, outcome of the project. Like I could literally see the color coming back into every one of their faces as they're like, yeah, we can do this. We can produce this. So sometimes I think, especially with gamification, people tend to think about technology and technology first solution. And a lot of what happens with gamification is made possible because of technology, right? We have an app and we can get things on our phone and that kind of stuff. But I think what we need to step back, and especially in a world where there's a lot of digital disconnect, people are connected digitally, but they're not connected. And there's nothing like sitting across from somebody in a card game or a board game and really connecting with them on a different level. Sometimes I call those kind of games social accelerants because they accelerate the breaking down of barriers, right? A cocktail party does that really well, but we have to use, drinks. But games do that really well, and you don't have to use drinks. And you can get to know somebody, and pretty soon you're laughing and you're engaged. So we were able to really save that project by totally rethinking what it meant to do a sales game and approaching it in a totally different direction. And was really excited about that because it really turned out well. Everybody's anxiety level went down, and we found some of the salespeople actually playing the card game, that evening at the bar. Now, I can't guarantee they were playing the same game, but they were playing a version of the game with our cards. So I think the lesson, at least for me from that perspective, is really don't be beholden to a technology or an approach when you get the feeling that it's not really resonating with the culture of the implementation team or the company.
That's fantastic, and this is something that has come up a couple of times before, and I love it because, as you said, when many people think about gamification, you think about straight off into video games, which are like huge production, millions of dollars that are involved, and that's fantastic. It's beautiful. I love video games. However, there's also other types of games, and it doesn't have to be technology first. I think that the main thing, and I think you'll agree with me, Karl, in gamification is the design, is the way you think about how you solve the problem, how you create engagement with your students, how you create engagement with if it's clients, how do you create engagement with your clients? And that could be in a digital sense in using a lot of technology, but it could be something that doesn't require either the budget nor the technology management that you could have in those kinds of projects, but it could be a card game. So that's something that I'm sure almost anybody in the audience could implement in a couple of days once you get your head around what you want to do with a card game. So I would like to ask you if you have any quick recommendations on somebody who's thinking, oh yeah, maybe I could do a card game. How would you tell them to get started when designing a card game?
Right. Yeah. So and I couldn't agree with you more. I really think I think gamification is a design affordance. It's not a technology, right? It's an approach to creating instruction. So if you're creating a card game, one of the first things I would recommend is play lots of different card games. So people tend to play and like the games that only they play and like, right? So if you like Exploding Kittens, you tend to just play Exploding Kittens. But you've got to play Exploding Kittens. You've got to play Dominion. You've got to play Crazy Eights, you've got to play Uno, you got to play all kinds of different card games to understand the mechanics and the interaction of the game and which kind of core dynamic is going to work for the learning problem that you're trying to address. So you can't just create every card game and make it look like Go Fish, right? So you need some kind of or Apples to Apples is another big one, or Cards Against Humanity. Like how many learning games look like Cards Against Humanity? So kind of break out of those molds. But then Once you do that, what you want to do is think about what kind of content that you want to teach and what actions you want the learners to take and what the learning outcome needs to be. So I kind of almost do that in parallel. I say, okay, what do I want the learners to be able to do and what kind of actions support what I want them to be able to do at the end of the game. So at the end of this game, for example, I wanted them to be able to correctly maybe open a sales call. So some of the scenarios we put were opening a sales call, but then we would have other cards where another player could challenge your opening so that you really had to hone the opening and make sure that the opening was the way that it needed to be. So kind of working through that. And then once you have the barest amount of content, play the game. I think one of the things that people get caught up, especially if you have an instructional design background, is we want to plan, document, and make everything perfect before we get started, right? Once it's perfect, then we'll go ahead and develop it. And games don't work like that at all. Games are very messy, which I guess is kind of why I'm sitting in my office surrounded by papers and all that kind of stuff. So I guess that's why I like games, because I'm very messy. So once you have the barest idea of what you want to do, go ahead and get a few people together and play the game. And you'll find out right away that you did not do a good job, which is okay. That's part of the process. And then modify and change the game as you're building it. So when we had this card game, we didn't poof the right card game right away. We had to play it a little while. We said, well, this can't work. And, the first version we had was actually kind of boring. You were just voting up and down if that was the right answer. We're like, that's not going to work. We need something else. So really, and it's great. You just take a deck of index cards, magic marker or highlighter, and okay, these are all my red cards. Boom, I'll highlight. Don't even buy colored index cards. Just color them yourselves. And I also think there's something about that tactile experience of actually creating something like that adds to the creativity process. But I would definitely recommend just go ahead, grab the content, start playing the game, modify the game. Don't get in love with your idea. Feel free to change it. Play test it several times with a group of friendly folks. And then once you think you've got it, dress it up a little bit and take it to some people that have nothing to do with you, that don't like you, that barely know you, and let them play the game without your interference. And then you can find out if it's meeting the goals that you want it to do. So I would definitely say iterate in terms of building the card game. Iterate in terms of getting your ideas out very rapidly and very quickly, and then start to hone your ideas during the process. It's not cascaded at all. It's very agile.
That sounds fantastic, Karl, and this ties up pretty well with the next question that I like to make, and it's about if you have any sort of process when you design gamification for learning. I'm guessing it has a lot to do with what you've been describing up to now, but if you want to get into any more details and in a couple of minutes, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So the first thing that we do if it's in a corporate setting is we make sure that we understand very explicitly what the corporate need is driving the learning need. I think a lot of times in organizations we forget that. We also then look, if it's an academic side, what is the academic outcome that I want the learners to have? And then I do this, and a lot of people kind of laugh, but I try to find out desperately if there's a non-gamification solution that might work. So for two reasons. One, I don't want to, everything isn't gamified as your answer. But two, if you can bulletproof why you're doing it this way, then eventually when you have to defend it, you'll be able to defend it. Too many times I've seen people go, talk about mistakes. People go, oh yeah, we decided to gamify that. I went to some conference or saw something and boom, so we gamified it. And that's a horrible reason to gamify something. So figure out, is it a motivational issue? Is it a usage issue? Is it an engagement issue? Is it an issue in terms of I want people to see the whole system? Like, why are you gamifying it? Then once you figure out why you're gamifying it and what the learning objectives are, then as I said before, you kind of want to get something really skeletal done. And so then you start testing that skeletal idea. You go through multiple iterations. When I work with the team, one of the things that I have to remind everybody frequently is this is an iterative process. So we're going to be frustrated because we're not there yet. We're going to struggle a little bit. It's part of the process. When I do a game design workshop and we have this procedure that I want people to do, and so we give them the task of creating a game. And literally I tell them, I said, for the first 15 minutes, you're going to sit there staring at a person across the table from you, not knowing what to do. Here's what you need to do, but you're still going to go through this process. And it's really interesting to watch. That happens again and again and again. And what the other thing is, as I said before, is play different games. People tend to, I play Monopoly all my life, so every game I create looks like Monopoly. That's not really – Monopoly's not the best game for every type of content. In fact, for a lot of content, Monopoly's not a good game. Or people go to Jeopardy, right? Jeopardy's, let's not use Jeopardy to solve problems. So there's different types of game approaches, and so you need to understand that a little bit, and you understand that by playing different kinds of games. And then once I do that, go through the testing process, then we always pilot it with a small subgroup, because no matter how good you think you are or that small group, if you don't pilot it, you will learn things that you never knew that you needed to know. So piloting and then launching it to the big group. So the other thing I'll say is, when you ask reviewers for feedback, give them areas of feedback that you want, right? So, you don't want feedback like, we don't like the color blue. Well, I don't care if you don't like the color blue. I don't like the color purple, right? So that's not really feedback that's helpful. So what you want to do is you want to say, I need feedback in terms of, did you understand the steps that you need to take on each turn? Did you understand where to click next? So you want feedback that's valuable to you, not just kind of don't open it up, because people will give you all kinds of feedback thinking they're helpful and they're not. So you need to be very specific about the feedback you want as you go through the process. So that's the process.
Sounds fantastic. Yeah, that's incredible. So remember, I guess one of the core things of what you were mentioning is the iterations and course correcting on the way. And this is very, very much from the startup world. They do it a lot as well. And it's something that makes a lot of sense, because you don't know what you don't know. And those are things that you find out on the way many times. And it's never too late to find out. You can always correct some of your things. Even if you launch it to your broader audience, which could be your classroom, maybe you launch it and you see something is not working as well as you wish. And, next year you will have another classroom or next semester, right, or in a couple of weeks you might have another group of people. And there's a way you can course correct there and make it not perfect, because I'm sure we don't do perfect things. That's part of our nature, but it'll get a lot better.
Right. And that's the one thing I love about teaching, right? I always say, look, if I mess up this semester, I get to do it again next semester, right? So I have another chance. I have another chance to keep iterating, which is great. Maybe not so great for the students, but I'll tell my students, I'll tell my students, hey, this class is continually iterating. Help me out, right? What's working for you? What's not working for you? So I try to pull back the curtain a little bit. I'll say, in this particular first 6 weeks, I'm going to use a fading technique. So I'm going to be really helping you out a lot, and then I'm going to kind of disappear, and you're going to wonder where I went. But you now have the skills to do it yourself. You don't need me to hold your hand as you go through the process. So I really try to do some metacognition or meta instruction about what kind of instructional strategies am I using on you, the student, so you can understand how those strategies work and then bring them into the instruction that you create.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But now, Karl, we were going to shift a little bit. Instead of going into story mode and the process, I'm going to ask you some quicker questions, things that probably are just going to pop up from your mind in the first instance. And the first one of them is I would like to know if there's something that you would call maybe a best practice or anything that you think that gamification project could benefit from. Almost any gamification project could benefit from.
Yeah, I think the thing that it could benefit from, and we talked about it, is iteration. So make sure that you're comfortable or that you accept or that you anticipate having to do several versions. And if you bake that into the plan, you should be well off.
Yeah, you're prepared for that situation.
Right.
Karl, what's your favorite game?
So it depends. So on my phone, I like Sid Meier's Civilization Revolution, which is kind of a Civilization light. I'm right now playing Exploding Kittens in terms of a card game. Board game, there's a game called Acquire that I've been playing with, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of like Monopoly, but a little bit more, in my opinion, sophisticated. And then I'm currently involved very heavily into Assassin's Creed,
Hmm.
the Origins version, which is I mean, you go to Egypt. Like I play it in the evening sometimes, and I'm going to Egypt for the night, right? And I walk around the desert and uh, walk around the pyramids and fight alligators, and it's really a fascinating world to be involved in. So I think if you're developing games or thinking about gamification or game-based learning, it's helpful to be involved with a lot of different games to give you certain things I like about one game I don't like about another game, or I like how this is applied in this game but not this game, and it just gives you a really good perspective of how elements of games can be used in other areas.
Quick side question: have you gone into role playing games? I haven't, so this is a question I've been starting to ask a bit more every once in a while.
I have a few times. I don't go into them a lot. You have to have a certain community to play
Yeah.
those role play games. So, um, and it's weird because even though on campus there's usually a group of people that want to play role play games, they don't necessarily want a professor there with them, or they do it at weird times. Like, okay,
Yeah.
11 o'clock Saturday night, we're going to get together. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's like 3 hours past my bedtime. So, I haven't been able to do that as much as I would like.
Yeah, it's something I've never been involved in, but I guess having a community, which is again a game mechanic as well, um, is something that would help secure such a thing. I've heard in several places and kind of been had a slight curiosity, but I haven't, to be honest, been like completely all into getting into such an experience. Karl, I would like to know if there's anybody that you would love to listen to interviewed in Professor Game.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people that are doing some really cool work. One person, she just wrote a book called Amy Jo Kim,
Yes.
and she wrote a book called Game Thinking. I think that's pretty cool. Clark Aldridge is coming out with a book called Short Simulations, and he has a really interesting perspective on creating simulations. And he's worked for the Gates Foundation and all kinds of organizations. I think he does really some interesting and intriguing work. So he would be somebody. And there's a woman named Ruth Clark, who wrote a really cool book called Scenario-Based E-Learning, and she talks about how you weave scenarios into instruction. And I think, when you think about the impact of storytelling, and you think of how compelling stories can be, and interacting through those stories through scenarios, I think Ruth would be a really interesting person as well. And then a colleague of mine, Sharon Bowler, who co-wrote Play to Learn with me. She would be a really interesting person to talk to as well. She's kind of led the game development of her company in a lot of different ways and created some really interesting games as well. So, yeah, there's lots of. I mean,
That's a beautiful Santa's list for sure.
Yeah, the cool thing about this field is there's so many really talented and pioneering people that would be really great to talk with.
Yeah. On a side note, somebody said like, "Oh, but do you think you will be able to sustain one episode a week?" Interviewing people of gamification. I haven't heard so many people around gamification. I said, are you kidding me?
Right.
What do you even mean? I mean, there's so many interesting people to interview. I mean, I'm sure I could spend at least like 3 years. That's, I don't know, 120 episodes and have interesting people. And of course, if there's an interesting gamification conference coming up and I can interview the person organizing to invite to the conference, that's amazing as well, even if it's a past guest. I mean, Monica Cornetti is organizing a conference and we'll probably have an episode talking about that. It's going to be in Chicago, I think, around fall. So I mean, that's another area that could be interesting, and exploring why that would be interesting. Even having episodes around the conference. I mean, there's so many things going on in this world that I'm super excited about it. So
it's thrilling. I mean, I could just list. Yeah, I could keep going. There's, Juliette Denning, Louise Pasterfield.
Juliette Denning is this week's. We're doing this interview on the 13th of March. She is on in this week. Yeah, so if you want to listen to her, she's episode 20.
She'll be fantastic. She is awesome. Yeah, she'll be fantastic.
She's phenomenal. Absolutely.
Yeah, she's phenomenal. When I was in China, I mean, there were people doing. I met with a gentleman who was doing board games all throughout China. He was from Turkey, so it was really kind of interesting. But he was teaching middle managers in China how to do finance through this really intricate board game. I mean, it's fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sounds amazing. Karl, aside from your books, which are, of course, incredible, is there any book that any particular book you would like to recommend to the engagers?
So, I think a really cool book, and this is not, and I want, when the engagers read it, they have to read it with two hats, right? One is kind of reading it, enjoying it, and the second is as a designer to figure out how this book is put together. But there's a book called S, just like the big letter S. It's called The Story of S by J.J. Abrams and Doug Durst. And it's a fascinating book, and it's this mystery novel. And the cool thing about it is, so when you get the book, there's like all these stuff stuffed in the pages, like postcards and mimeograph pieces of paper. And in the margins of the book is this story between this man and this woman who are exchanging this book in a library and writing letters to each other, notes to each other in the margins. So you have the main story, and then you have the story in the margins, and they're both intertwined. It's a fascinating. The hardest part about this book is, how do I read it? Right? Do I read the whole novel first?
Does it bring instructions?
It does not, and I've tried different ways, and I haven't found honestly, haven't found the optimal way to read it. But it's fascinating, and so it's basically like this mystery in a book with like physical, tangible items and options, and it's really well done.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. I had never heard of it.
Yeah, check it out. Yeah, but you have to be. And the other problem with that book is you can't take it like when you travel, because all these loose leaf things are in it. So if you dropped it, it would be the end of it.
Yeah, definitely.
So
it's a read-at-home book.
Exactly. Yeah.
And certainly not a library book.
No.
Karl, what would you say is your superpower when creating gamification?
I would say one of my superpower is using an evidence-based approach. So one of the things that I try really hard to do, and when I first got into gamification, was to tie the things that are done in gamification back to research-based origins. Okay. So the thing I try to do is I try to make sure that everything that I do has a basis in research, and so that it can be defended and that there is a clear rationale behind why it's done.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And there's a huge benefit that we can all get by following your materials, reading your books, because then we will have all that evidence and we'll be able to use it as well. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I try like I'll read an article, put references in the back. In my PowerPoint slides, I always put references on the bottom. So please feel free to use that. I mean, I think the field moves forward when we move from a place of evidence. Yeah. And you think, what happened to the field of medicine, right? People were putting leeches on each other and getting rid of the spirits, right? And then research came along and said, no, this is really the way we should do it. And there's research behind, people have been researching games for like 50 years. Like it makes me so mad when people say, oh, there's no research behind games for learning. There's a ton of research. What we have to do is go through it and pick out, okay, what works well, what doesn't work, what kind of game element works in what kind of situation. Those are all things that can be knowable and that we can pursue.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Karl, we've arrived to that part of the interview where we'll pick a random question from the audience. Okay. And throw it at you, basically.
All right.
Hope you're good at baseball and catching it. So, no, just kidding. So I'm gonna pick it from here. Okay, there you go. This one looks interesting, and I think you will be pretty well equipped to answer it. So it says, how does the brain work when learning new things? How can we relate this to games and gamification? So it's a broad question for sure.
Wow, that is a broad question. Yeah. So,
but I found it quite beautiful, and that's why I left it there, because I do think it can be quite interesting to get your perspective on this.
Right. So I mean, I think one of the things that I think games work really well in terms of the brain. So one of the things the brain likes to do is, well, there's a couple things. One, the brain likes patterns. So the brain is always looking for patterns and finding patterns even when patterns don't exist. So you can definitely leverage that in terms of a game. The brain is also looking for anchoring new knowledge to past knowledge. So if you can have a game where you have a few references, like let's say you're teaching a new manager, new techniques. Well, if you create a game that anchors in some techniques that the manager already knows or is already comfortable with, then you can leverage that into the new experience for the learner who's playing the game. So I think as the brain processes information, and the brain's not – it's not exactly like a computer. A lot of people say, oh, you input, output. But the brain works at a lot of different levels. So one of my favorite is there's been some really interesting research about learning from failure. And some research that shows in math problems, students who get a question wrong, even if they don't know it's wrong, have greater brain activity than a student who gets the question right. Which I think is fascinating. Yeah. So the idea or the thought is that little bit of struggle of trying to figure out what the right answer is causes neural synapses to fire, and that's what causes additional brain activity. So I think that's really kind of a fascinating –
and that's where you learn, for sure.
Right. Exactly. There's a thing called desirable difficulty. And desirable difficulty is where we want the learner to struggle because that struggle leads to greater learning than just kind of the hand-holding that we're used to. And if you think about it personally, your greatest learning experience ever probably came after struggle, and then all of a sudden like the aha moment. But if you just get something really easily, the chances of it staying with you forever might not be as well as if you struggle to get it and to understand it. So I think I think it's okay for us to create learning activities and games and gamification where people struggle a little bit, and people are okay with that because it's growing the brain, it's that desirable difficulty, it's linking to what we already know, but then taking the next step and to something that we don't know. So I think all those elements can play in really well as we think about growing the brain. There's other research that shows that I thought this was interesting from a story perspective. They did MRIs on people reading a story and found out, if you're reading about problem solving, the area in your brain that is used for problem solving lights up on the MRI. If you're reading about somebody running, the area in your brain that has to do with running lights up. So it's almost as if your brain is kind of practicing what needs to be done as it hears those elements of the story. So I think there's a lot going on in our brains that can really be leveraged by games, gamification, engagement, and putting together the puzzle pieces. I think modern education does too much of giving you content and ideas and information and not enough of letting you kind of grow your own ideas, own thoughts, and own approaches.
Yeah, it's certainly a topic I'm very passionate about, and how many things can be changed and improved in education. But we'll have time for that another day because we're closing up the interview today. I'm afraid because I could spend all day talking about this, especially with somebody like Karl. But I would like to know if there's any advice you would like to give to our listeners. Anything else that you would like to add to this interview? How can we connect with you? And then we'll say game over.
Okay, great. No, so my advice is to, as always, is to play lots of games. You can't really understand games by watching somebody play the game. You've got to go out and do it. The second is embrace failure. It's part of the learning process. It's probably one of the most valuable parts of the learning process. And then reflect on your failure. That's not fun to do, but we learn a lot from reflection. In terms of getting in touch with me, I'm on LinkedIn. If you just put Karl Kapp, you'll find me on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. Twitter is a good place to get in touch with me. It's at KKAPP at Twitter. And you can email me at karlkapp.com to get in touch that way. I've got some lynda.com courses and some books, as you've mentioned, and lots of resources. I try to put as much out there as I can. So please take advantage of that.
Yeah, definitely. Karl's very generous in that sense, and please take on his offer of getting some of his content and digesting it, because there's a lot of interesting things to get. So thank you very much, Karl, for this interview, for your time, for all your knowledge, all the interesting ideas that you're helping spread. And it's time to say game over.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks to you. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Karl Kapp. And it's been 25 episodes now. Wow, I'm really happy to make it this far. Well, they say that podcasts that are there to stay really commit after around 25 episodes. So here I am, and continue to be committed to you, Engagers. And we are making a 1-minute survey. I would love to hear from you. So please go to professorgame.com/survey25. That's SURVEY25, the numbers. So that way I can get to know you a bit better. Thanks in advance.